I will introduce today's panelists and ask them to come on stage when I introduce them. First up is Dr. Eric Dorfman, president of the Linda Hall Library and curator of Chain to the Sky exhibition. Dr. Dorfman has been at the library like 1 year and 3 days now, right?
That's right,
So
yes.
just celebrated his 1 year anniversary. And he has a PhD from the University of Sydney on scale-dependent habitat use of water birds in Eastern and Central Australia. He is the author of several popular books on New Zealand natural history and climate change, as well as scholarly papers on museum education, public programming, Egyptology, and the ecology of wetland birds. Next is Kristen Heath-Acre, is the state ornithologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. She received her bachelor's and yes. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in biology at Texas Tech University, did research on songbird forest ecology across North and Central America, including Hawaii, which is a big change from Hawaii to Missouri.
A little bit.
She also got her master's degree working on snowy plover movement ecology. She moved to Missouri in 2020 to work for the University of Missouri on the reintroduction of the brown-headed nuthatch that I mentioned, as well as woodland songbird abundance in response to land management practices in the Ozark Highlands. Actually, she has a picture in the East Gallery. The photo of one of her colleagues holding the brown-headed nuthatch was taken by Kristen. And I just realized that this morning as we were walking through the exhibit. And our final panelist is Chris Cardwell, is a program manager at Deep Roots KC. And Deep Roots is an organization promoting the use of native plants, and you'll hear more about later, but it's an organization I've gotten to know really well over the past couple of years. They're doing amazing work in the city and the region. Chris leads their Nature Advisors program, as well as other outreach programs. He earned a BA in art history and French at the University of Kansas. While there, he also started his native plants journey. His career highlights so far include establishing the Green Stewards program at Bridging the Gap, running his own residential landscaping company, and being an urban conservationist with Miami County. Growing up in the Smoky Hills of northern Kansas, exploring the grassland ecosystems instilled a quiet song in the back of Kristen's head. So welcome, everyone. I'm getting a little feedback, I think. Yeah. Maybe I'm standing under the speaker. Hang on 1 second. Let me move this. I'd like to begin with just a little discussion about bird populations. And, you know, Kristen, it was last weekend, I saw a cerulean warbler, and I hadn't seen one in a long time. And it was the first one I've seen this year. What is it just me, or are there fewer birds now than when I became interested in birds in the 1970s?
It's not just you.
Okay.
And not to be blunt, but birds aren't doing so well. You know, I don't want to say every species of bird is declining, but across the board, you know, globally, nationally, and in Missouri, we are seeing some alarming trends in bird populations, bird population declines. A study, which many of you may be aware of, and came out in 2019, that showed we've lost 3 billion birds, net loss of 3 billion birds in the past 50 years. So since 1970. And that's just when they started the study. That's when they started looking at the data consistently. So we don't know 50 years before that what we've been seeing. And some species are more drastically affected. Cerulean warblers aren't doing so well. Habitat loss is a big cause of that. But certain guilds of species are doing less well than others. When I say guild, I mean, a group of birds that use the same habitat or eat the same kind of food, like grassland birds are doing perhaps the worst. We've lost 3 and 4 meadowlarks, since 1970. And I get these phone calls from private landowners, from the public. Where have all the meadowlarks gone? When I was growing up, I used to hear them all the time. And now I don't hear any. And that's just very, very sad to me. So certain species aren't doing as well. There are some species that are doing okay or better. And I hope we can kind of get to talk about those too, because those are kernels of hope. I don't want to just put on doom and gloom, but there's certainly cause for alarm.
Bobwhite quail is a bird I
Bobwhite quail.
never hear anymore.
Mhm. Yep. And that one gets a lot of attention in Missouri, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
Hunters really miss their bobwhite. And
Is there still a hunting season?
there is, if you can find them.
Wow.
But, loss of those grasslands has really affected their populations significantly.
I gave a brief bio of Dr. Dorfman, but Eric, he has done bird ecology research in 3 or 4 continents. Certainly Australia, South Africa, Europe, I believe, and maybe Central or South America as well.
Well, if you count the Galapagos, otherwise.
Yes, they count.
Yeah, it counts. Well, okay,
Ecuador.
then you can, I'll tick off that continent.
really
Yeah,
counts.
that's fine. Yeah.
Are we seeing the same trends in bird population declines?
Absolutely, absolutely. And Kristen just mentioned the net loss of 3 billion birds is 10 billion worldwide due to human causes. So this is absolutely, I mean, the industrialized countries are technologically better able to impact bird populations because of large scale farming, quite a bit of it, urbanization. So a place like Brazil just simply can't make that sort of impact. However, globally, partly due to sort of local effects like habitat loss, but also global effects like climate change or climate destabilization are also affecting, and ocean plastic, another huge problem for birds. So really, we kind of are not intentionally, mostly not intentionally, but we've done a real number on bird populations globally.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah,
because
it is.
We have this data from the past 50 years. Like, where are we going to be 50 years from now? We can get into more of that a little later. One of the, as I mentioned, one of the highlights of the exhibition is what people can do to help birds. It seems you hear numbers, 3 billion, 10 billion. It's like, boy, the scope of it it's just incredible to think about. But there are also ways that all of us, each one of us, whether at home, at work, can make a difference to help bird populations. And one of the important areas, certainly here in Kansas City, in the Midwest, in Missouri, in the Midwest, is going native, planting native plants. And Chris, that's the heart of Deep Roots KC. If you could talk a little bit about your work specifically and generally, what is the mission and goals of Deep Roots KC?
Certainly, Eric. Deep Roots KC is in its 10th year now as a nonprofit advocacy organization for native landscaping, native plants. At the core of it, it evolved out of the Westport Garden Club, which meets actually in this room.
Yeah.
That Nature Conservancy's Doug Ladd inspired hundreds and thousands of professionals like myself introduced the concept of ecological deep time to me, understanding that our impacts last far longer than our lives do. When we build our relationship with nature as humans, especially as Americans, it's all too often nature is out there, and that there are spaces that are designated and set aside for the protection of nature. In the same way that we have zoos and aquariums, nature is to be visited, as opposed to the inverse of that, which is that nature is actually present all around us. It's statistically almost a plurality of people surveyed, when they engage with the bird population, for example, where do they engage with it? And it's outside your kitchen window while you're doing dishes. It's at the feeder. And Deep Roots KC really stands on the concept that each one of us as empowered citizens in a free space here, we are all empowered to protect the natural space in our own environment, in our immediate environment. So the residential sphere is where we actually have the means to do something. So it's kind of a paradigm shift, and we're actually witnessing within my career that paradigm shift is evident and succeeding. Proof is right here today.
Mm.
And Kristen, you mentioned some birds are doing okay, bird populations. Does that include some bird species that we commonly see around our homes
Yeah.
and gardens?
Absolutely. Yep. Native species that you would see, commonly in your garden. Cardinals, American robins, they do very well with urban environments. And those birds that are generalists, that'll eat lots of different things, often do really well. Conversely, you see some non-natives or invasive species like the European starling, the house sparrow, that also do really well. And so you actually have that kind of competition going on. But on the whole, some urban species do really well. And those native plantings really do help those in particular.
Yes. Chris, how difficult is it, or has it been to convince people to plant native? I mean, do you hear people say, boy, I really like my Bradford pear tree. It's beautiful. What do you say to those? Or do you hear that anymore?
We choose to surround ourselves with like-minded individuals, right? But that's part of the advocacy piece, is that you have a job to do of convincing. It's difficult for anybody. It's a human quality to recognize a mistake and to move forward in a corrective way. When it comes to native landscaping, there is a whole spectrum of approaches to it, where rewilding, that kind of came out of the generation previous, 60s and 70s, right? Go back to the country, let everything grow kind of willy-nilly. And that is a wilderness and an ecological balance that is good for nature. But we have to apply that in a setting that adheres to city codes, that functions as a designed aesthetic in the built environment. And so there is a way that those two things can align, and that you can select species that are ecologically sound and support bird populations that also then fit a design aesthetic that can be sharp and cool and angular and urban. And that's where we are finding the greatest success is a designed landscape that selects the correct species for ecological value. And it's kind of a best of both worlds. You can have your cake and eat it too in the landscape.
Was there a bill, did it get passed to ban non-native plant sales?
Now I'm on the other side of the state line. I'm a Kansan.
Okay.
And it is being kicked around. That is, the political hot potato down in Jeff City right now of invasive plants. The Kansas in Topeka I had the privilege of testifying before the Department of Agriculture Committee, and the state of Kansas Secretary of Ag actually signed into effect a quarantine on calorie pair. So one enemy at a time, political will is there, and the impacts, and this is, we'll get to the kind of the positive takeaways. Everybody from all walks of life in America are recognizing the importance of conservation as intrinsic to the success of everybody. Doesn't matter what your slant is. So banning calorie pair sales and distribution in the state of Kansas is one tiny step in a long march to restoration.
It would be an important step.
I believe so.
Eric, beyond bird populations, what broader ecological impacts result from decline in bird species? Is there a ripple effect that goes through the ecosystems when you lose one species, one group of?
Yeah, so there's an ecologist in the late 60s was talking about likening the global environment to an airplane, and each species is a rivet in the airplane, and when you pick one out, it flies just fine. You'd pick two out, three out, and eventually it's going to go from flying to falling. And that's one of the big questions. It's because birds are kind of in the middle. They prey on things and they are preyed on themselves, right? So you take out a particular species that is part of an ecosystem. It's very difficult to predict what exactly is going to happen. So one of the examples is the American chestnut, which people know probably that was completely decimated by a fungus. And that was principally spread, but the chestnuts were principally spread by wild turkeys. And so, of course, you remove the chestnut, the turkey population declines. And so you've got and then the things that would eat the turkeys, coyotes, for instance, also would suffer. So you've got this whole suite of issues, and it's very difficult to pick even a group of species like birds and say, okay, take birds out of the population and what happens? It's just complex, but the relationship between birds and pollinators is also a really important one. Of course, that's flow into the bird system from the pollinators. But you've got this whole energy flow, like you imagine your own garden, right? You've got the sun, the plants, the pollinators, the birds, all right, let's just throw it in there, the cats, the neighborhood cats that eat your birds. There's this whole food web happening. And that's just a very simple system. You imagine somewhere like the Amazon rainforest is just incredibly complex.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But great point. We'd love to know. Yeah.
Kristen, one of the success stories that's mentioned in the exhibition that you were very much a part of was the reintroduction of the brown-headed nuthatch into Missouri. Could you talk about that story? And let me begin, I guess, with a follow-up question. Why the brown-headed nuthatch?
So that gets at the beginning. If we reverse back to about 1900, earlier really, in the late 1800s, the Missouri Ozarks were primarily shortleaf pine woodland. So big pines, open understory, grassy. You could drive a truck through it if there were trucks back then. And logging companies came in and decimated this area. They could clear 70 acres in a day. They just really, poof, it was gone. And during that time, we think the brown-headed nuthatch, which is a pine woodland obligate, so you only find them in these sorts of habitats, were lost. We also think that, that the red-cockaded woodpecker was lost as well from Missouri, so extinct from Missouri. And fast forward to 1990s, early 2000s, the Forest Service, Mark Twain Forest Service, Missouri Department of Conservation, these partners started to do habitat management, habitat restoration work, prescribed fires. They were returning fire to the landscape because when these pine woodlands were, cut, it regrew as hardwood forest, which is unsuitable for brown-headed nuthatches. And so clearing that, the oak hardwood, thinning it out, reintroducing fire to the landscape because that's a natural, process, in the Missouri Ozarks and many other places. We've found that, habitats becoming restored. Anecdotally, you can go down there and look at it and it just looks beautiful. It looks a lot like the historic photos. And so researchers in the late, 2015, 2016, it's the late 2010s. I don't know why I was going to say that, but they thought the habitat's back. We need to start thinking about holistic ecosystem restoration. You can bring the habitat back, but what does that mean if the other pieces of the ecosystem aren't also there? And brown-headed nuthatches are a primary cavity excavator. They excavate their own cavities, and like other woodpeckers, they employ an important role in the ecosystem because other things use those cavities as well. Chickadees, titmice, some rodents, insects, they're an important part of this ecosystem. And so returning them made a lot of sense. And elsewhere across their population in the Southeast, brown-headed nuthatches are actually doing really well. And so this idea of returning them to Missouri had a lot of positive notes. If we're taking them from a population that's healthy and growing, we're not doing that population detriment. We have this restored landscape that is missing a piece of its ecosystem puzzle. And so that, idea really took root in 2019 with my predecessor, Sarah Kendrick, who was the ornithologist then. And she brought together partners and said, let's do this. We've been talking about this for decades. We have the restored landscape. We have tens of thousands of restored hectares of pine woodland. And she really got the ball rolling then. So in 2020 and 2021, we brought 102 brown-headed nuthatches back to Missouri. And we're actually bringing 100 more just this year. And we have plans to reintroduce several more hundred to really get at an established population in Missouri.
They will probably never reach Kansas City without that pine.
Yep.
Pine
No, you're
woodland,
not going
right?
to see them here,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
I know, you mentioned the Southeast. Eric, you talked about seeing,
Yeah,
they're pretty common in North Carolina.
Yeah, very. I recently, a year ago, moved from North Carolina, and during COVID, there was a feeder right outside my window, and they were always on it. They were chasing every other little bird away. It was
Yeah.
very cute.
Where they are, they're common, they're doing
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And the population is doing well here, right, in Missouri.
Holding steady. We would like to see more. We'd like to see more baby nuthatches, more native Missourian brown-headed nuthatches. And that's why we're bringing more.
I want to get down there and see it. It's in the southeast part of the state, central. And
Yeah, South Central, yep.
Yeah, and they have, if you haven't heard one's call, just go on YouTube, just search brown-headed nuthatch call. It's mentioned in the exhibition, but they sound like a little rubber ducky squeeze toy.
Mhm.
It must be really weird to hear that in the woods.
It is. I would play it at my home for various reasons and my dog would just go nuts because it sounds like a dog toy. It really does.
It really does.
And they're very, very cute, very
Yeah.
small, but really special birds.
Yeah, well, it's great to see that habitat restored. And
It's beautiful. Yeah, just that alone, just going down there to look at the habitat, it's so different. And they've done such a wonderful job.
And it's just very similar to the native plant species in Missouri that probably 100 years ago, we probably full of native plants. And Chris, are there specific plants, native plants that you recommend if someone contact Deep Roots, and that's deeproots.org. I should mention that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, that really, it's a conversation all into itself. We could have a whole nother 2-hour panel on what we refer to
We've
as
got time, right?
keystone species. Let's
No.
be here next Saturday. No. So the relationship with birds are a symptom. And I'm certainly not to undermine at all the significance of the decline of bird populations, but it's a symptom of a decline of insect populations.
That's right.
And so the removal of a food source and the removal of sustenance in the ecosystem for the population of songbirds in North America is the foundation of their decline. And those insect populations rely on keystone plants. And those are native plants that have evolved along with the Animalia over the course of the 14,000 years since the last ice age, right? Those insects and the larval population of those insects is the primary food source for the majority of bird populations. So let's say we have 120 something species of picture-worthy birds that are in your book in Kansas City. About a dozen of them will come to your bird feeder that feed on the seed and the fruit and the stuff you buy at the store. The other 100+ species of birds feed only on the insects that rely on native fauna or native flora to sustain their populations. So the bird decline is a symptom of the insect decline, and the insect decline is a symptom of the flora decline. So those, you got to walk it back, trace the trickle back to the faucet, and understand that it's an insect problem. And then it's also a soil problem. The microbes in the soil and the invertebrates that exist in the soil profile beneath our feet, that's where the problem really begins. And so native species, such as oaks, for example, loosely, the white oak family supports over 500 species of invertebrates as larval hosts. Those little juicy, squishy caterpillars are delicious. And that's what songbirds rear their next generation on. So the baby brown-headed nuthatches in a pine forest rely on those pines because the sawflies who lay their eggs on those pine needles. So that's where native plants come in. It's not a catch-all, it's not a panacea, but it is a tool that is easily employed by anybody with ground to work.
I'll take your word for it about caterpillars.
Delicious.
Delicious, right?
I was gonna say, is that from personal experience?
No comment. Right?
No comment.
You know, you mentioned insect population decline, soil, of course, birds, what we're talking about. It's, you know, you could put that under the broad umbrella of climate change as well. I think that's also a starting point. And Eric, I know you wrote just a wonderful blog post.
Oh,
And you can find this at ericdorfman.com. It's a great follow. I highly recommend it. And the title of the post was "The Paradox of Fear: Why AI Terrifies Us More Than Climate Change." And we can talk a little more about climate change, but what was you talk a little bit about just the essence of your, of that.
well, that post specifically, sure. Okay. So, you know, and I wrote this a few months ago, right? And things in AI are changing so quickly. But, you know, there was this sort of general panic about what's going to happen with AI. And here I've even written a book on climate change and feel very passionately that we are in such big trouble. And I mean, thinking about climate change, what a perfect weekend to be talking about climate change, right? So, and Kansas City is getting significantly warmer. And not only are we having more intense heat periods, but also the precipitation is kind of bifurcating between periods of intense rainfall and drought, as opposed to something kind of more, well, livable. So we see the effects of climate change. We see all kinds of things from Well, I mean, there's so many stories about wild changes in wildlife proportions, up mountains, all kinds of things. There's this enormous body of evidence that climate change is really a global catastrophe. And call it climate change is a sort of, we don't really call it global warming anymore. Climate change, it'd be better to think of it as climate destabilization. And that's the thing that is, because it's not always warmer, sometimes it's colder. But AI is pretty much, it's brand new. Why should we be so afraid of AI? Disproportionate to this other phenomenon that there's still so much rhetoric around, is it true, is it not true? And my conclusion in this post is that we have a face of evil for AI, right? It looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger in a metal suit, right? Hollywood has given a point of reference for what robots look like, thinking robots look like, war looks like. Climate change is really still sort of nebulous, right? There's no super villain that is representing climate change. And perhaps that's it. And I'm not downplaying the potential of AI to do both great good and great harm, but I am saying that we mustn't neglect the data set that we already have and be concerned about that.
Kristen, staying with this climate change theme, what are some of the things you see with bird populations related to climate change? I read an article, I forget where, about birds and their environments being mismatched.
Oh, yes.
Could you talk about that or other climate related
Yeah,
issues that you
absolutely.
see?
In terms of mismatch, that generally refers to migratory birds. So migratory birds have very, regular times that they leave south for migration in the fall or leave north for migration in the spring. Some of it's cued by sunlight, some of it's cued by weather though. And food sources, a spike in food sources, they will feed up, fatten up, and then leave. And so with this warming climate, their food sources, insects mostly, if those have emerged early because it's too warm, too early in the spring, when those birds come in the spring and if those insects have already emerged, that mistiming can be catastrophic. And something about migratory birds, they often go to the same place every year, either as individuals or across species and groups. There are certain bays that birds will go to and just gorge themselves. And if that food source is mistimed because of climate change for whatever reason, that can be catastrophic on that one population. So the mistiming of migration and their food sources, their stopover sites, is in particular very concerning.
Are we starting to see that in Missouri?
I don't know if there's been specific research on that one specific thing, but I could almost guarantee you, yes.
We've certainly seen species expand their range. I assume it's climate change.
Yes.
One bird that I think of as a desert Southwest bird, the roadrunner, is now in Missouri.
Yeah,
That's just-
exactly.
This is mind-boggling to me, and maybe it's been around a while in Missouri, but
It may have been more eruptive or, just a rare transient, but now
there's a
we're
popular,
seeing-
there's
yeah,
a popular, as
seeing-
far as maybe Jefferson City, right? Or
potentially as
north.
far north as that. I'm not sure. Definitely in the southern part of the state.
Yeah.
Another bird that many of you may have picked up on, if you are a birder, limpkins have been seen more and more recently, and they feed on mollusks and mussels and things. And they're actually expanding northward following invasive snails, which are expanding northward because it's above the warming climate. And so, expansion of range is really interesting. You mentioned I worked in Hawaii for a while, and a big problem there is avian malaria.
Mhm.
And the mosquito is actually non-native to Hawaii, which is amazing to me. But with the mosquito came avian malaria. And these birds, which had no exposure to it, are highly susceptible. It's devastating to Hawaiian bird populations. And as the climate warms, mosquitoes are able to exist farther and farther, higher in elevation. And so birds that are, escaping the mosquitoes are running out of room. So that's just another example of range expansion on a sort of elevational level. The effects are compounding and wide ranging.
There are no snakes in Hawaii either.
There shouldn't be.
Yeah. They put a lot of money and effort into
They
keeping
do,
snakes
thank
out,
goodness.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
That would devastate the bird population. That would-
Absolutely.
As it did in Guam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, that's-
exactly. Yeah, that's a scary thought, snakes in Hawaii.
Every 2 or 3 years, I read about a new attempt to eradicate snakes in Guam, but
Mhm.
nothing seems to work. But
Mhm.
it's just, their bird population is completely wiped
Basically
out.
gone. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just a few in captivity, like the Marianas crow. Yeah.
Yeah, and I believe if I have the history right, it was just snakes brought to Guam during World War II, when there was just a lot of military shipments back and forth all across the South Pacific. And it's just, I know Hawaii is just always nervous about the snake finding its way
Yep.
to the state. Chris, with climate change, I would say native plants probably are more resilient than invasive species, and living in a varied climate. And there probably are there native plants that people can use that will do well in a warming climate, a changing environment?
In general, yes. Native landscapes tend to express more resilience, once established, drought tolerance. And so the destabilized climate, the unpredictable climate, the back and forth between rain bombs and drought period, an established native plant landscape tends to be more adaptive to that. When it comes to resource scarcity as well, irrigation for our residential and commercial landscapes comes at great cost, as well as maintenance costs as well. The mowing, the perpetual weekly maintenance. So all of those resource intensive practices tend to be less intensive with a native landscape. When it also comes to range variance, we have several experts in our field who are anticipating climate change. And so species selection for designed landscapes is becoming a little bit more forward thinking. And we're seeing more southern species of trees and shrubs that are becoming more appropriate for the Kansas City region. Even ornamental things like crepe myrtle and certain magnolia species that in my parents' generation would not have done well here. But my Southern Florida grandmother had a passion for them. And so now my mother can embrace them here in sort of a positive spin on climate change, right? We're bringing old Georgia back up to Kansas City.
Yeah, that's
silver lining. But as a general understanding, yes, those native species tend to be much more resilient once established.
Sure. I also don't mind fewer snowstorms, less severe snowstorms, but that's another story. So I do want to leave several minutes for audience questions, and we have a large live stream audience tuning in today from across the world. So if you're watching remotely, type your questions into the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. during the Q&A. Before we go to questions though, I maybe just going to go around the horn and ask, we've talked a lot about pessimistic stuff. Is there, what gives you optimism? Is there something that you're working on or you're thinking about that you're optimistic about? Maybe Chris, we can start with you to put you on the spot.
Try to be, for the sake of brevity, I suppose, try to keep it simple.
No.
What inspires me every morning to get back to the desk and get down to the bones of this work is the broad appeal. We live in a very polarized nation. The empathetic American in this room can be very easily discouraged, right? In conservation, it is a unifying field. It is a space in which people from all over the world, from all different walks of life, can come together on and stand on a shared value. It is apolitical, and organizationally, nonprofit, government agencies, private citizens, corporations, everybody is at the table when it comes to conservation, because that is the rug on which we all stand. And when that rug is pulled out from under us, it doesn't matter where you stand on issues of socio-political merit. Without the green outside, without the clean water and the clean air, none of it matters. So we see organizations, private landowners can employ resources from Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Quail Unlimited, Quail Forever, the Department of Conservation, an immense resource. And there are so many diverse stakeholders in these conversations that it makes the end goal of conservation far more reachable when we have partners from every single sphere of our socio-political world in America. That gives me a little pat on the back. We got some support.
That's good to hear. Kristen?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really well said. And I'm glad you kind of put Missouri, the Department of Conservation kind of in the spotlight there, because coming from another state, I feel like I really appreciate the resources the state has to offer, and the amount of resources and funds and partnerships that go into, habitat management and really, truly making a difference. That definitely gives me hope. Also, in terms of conservation success stories, who here knows what the duck stamp is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that study I mentioned earlier, in 2019, they showed population trends of different guilds of birds, grassland birds, forest birds. And one guild of birds that was actually doing better, or as well as they were in 1970, was wetland species, water birds. And that is in large part due to funds from the migratory bird duck stamp. And so it just goes to show that if we put our resources where our passions are, absolutely, you can make a difference. You can reverse declines. You can really make a difference. So that gives me hope, and that definitely drives me day to day, is knowing that it's totally possible. Here's the evidence.
That's good stuff. Eric?
Well, it's funny, Kristen, you pick, in my mind, I was going, now, which do I want to talk about? And as a water bird specialist, that's one thing that I can really get alongside, that, and it is the hunters, Ducks Unlimited. There is a big groundswell of people wanting to protect wetlands, which, is a significant change from 100, 200 years ago, where wetlands were just bogs that needed to be drained for progress. So that's great. And it gives me hope, like you were saying, for the rest of the species, if we that it's not too late, that we can, for things like the dodo and the Carolina parakeet, yes, it's too late. But the things that we still have, and of course the brown-headed nuthatch is a perfect example, that we can make a difference, that the kind of work that Chris and Deep Roots is doing is valuable. And so that's where that was a preamble to the thing I was going to say, which
Okay.
is the thing that personally gives me a, a feeling of hope, getting to the office in the morning. I've got I planted a pollinator garden. And the thing, even though I'm really busy running around, new house, doing all this, I said, okay, I'm going to plant a pollinator garden because of a talk that I, sitting out there, heard here about bees, which was great. And even posted all of these pollinators this morning on Instagram, having a personal relationship. I know every single plant, and my milkweed has aphids, so get out the neem oil. That is so replenishing to have that personal experience with a patch of ground that I can steward. That is hugely beneficial to me in my daily life. And by extension, we're sitting on a 14-acre arboretum. And for 80 years, it has really just been our front yard. And now we are kind of pivoting to a more strategic use of this, not only for education, which is really core value of the library, but also for conservation work, and really thinking about the kind of messages and the kind of landscaping techniques that Deep Roots espouses to turn this into a much more productive environment for wildlife. And as that gets going over the next year, 2 years, that's going to be a real source of inspiration, not only for me, but I'm sure for our entire community.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, I know. It's going to be great.
Yeah.
Get your spade.
Yeah, I'm ready. All right, we've got about 10 minutes or so to the bottom of the hour, so we can open up to questions. Matt was pretty quick there. I was going to say, heads up, be warned, the lights are coming on, but my colleague Matt will come around with a microphone. Since we're live streaming and recording today's program, we want to get the audio of your question on the live stream. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. I'm curious, is predation by house cats a significant factor on bird populations in the city?
Do you want to answer that?
I'll take
And
that one.
I'll follow up too, but go, please.
You asked in our city in particular, almost certainly yes. Across the board, I think in North America, we lose 1 billion birds annually to cats, outdoor cats. And it is a hot button issue. People love their cats and cats love to be outdoors, but they are voracious predators and just really do a number on our native birds. And so, yeah, the answer is almost certainly yes.
And so globally, there are 2 billion birds a year consumed by cats, which, if you can do the math, America is responsible for half of that. And an Australian study showed that one house cat over the course of a night will cover 1 square kilometer of suburban environment, killing things, taking things out of nests, whatever. So you imagine one cat, multiply that by a whole neighborhood of cats. It's pretty devastating. And I will say, as a cat owner, my cat is only indoors. He's never been outside ever. And that's, I love my cat, and that is the responsible way to have him.
And if I may, in some other microhabitat certification programs around the country, whether or not you allow your feline friends to go outside is one key marker of whether or not your habitat, your personal landscape is actually habitat, or whether it's a veritable death trap for the birds that you're inviting into your landscape to then allow them to be prey for your domesticated animals.
With the success of the brown-headed nuthatch, is there any plan to try to reintroduce the red-cockaded woodpecker?
That's a question I get almost every time I talk about brown-headed nuthatches, because it is a pie in the sky. This is what we should shoot for. Their habitat requirements are very different from brown-headed nuthatches. Their ranges are much larger. They require live, very mature pines to nest in. And so, the extent of restored habitat is just not there yet for red cockaded woodpeckers. I wouldn't say it's even close, unfortunately. We're establishing small, steady populations of nuthatches, but I would say we're decades away from red cockaded woodpeckers. That shouldn't be no, we'll never do this. That should be someday this will happen, but it's going to take longer because these processes, the thinning, the prescribed fires, it's landscape management. It's on a huge scale and it just takes forever. I could never be a forester or a landscape. I don't have the patience for it. I want to see things this season. I want to see things next season, not a decade from now, 2 decades from now. So it's a tough, tough reality, but it'll be a while. It'll be a long while, but it's a great question. And it's definitely a goal.
Is solar punk a possible future?
What was that?
Is solar punk a possible future?
Solar punk. I don't know what that is.
We're not sure.
Is that like a dystopian, post-apocalyptic?
Solar power?
Solar,
Most using solar power, wind power.
oh, solar power. Sorry, was that to any of us particularly? Did you, okay, to you,
I think it was to you, Eric.
all right, it'll be to me, that's fine. So, yes, it absolutely is. And in fact, just yesterday, I saw something very interesting on Instagram, which was people who have invented windows that will capture the sun's energy. So solar power, clear window material. I think as the technology gets better, it'll be much more affordable, but already it has the potential to make a really big difference. So yeah, great question.
There's also immense opportunities within solar energy to incorporate habitat into those land use practices. So massive acreages of solar fields that then also can provide ecosystem support through the selection of species that are planted in those solar fields. And regenerative agriculture practices, rotational grazing, and so on. There is opportunities and great work being done to, yes, have a clean, infinite source of power, as well as supporting ecosystem and increasing biodiversity, restoring the ecology of those areas.
And this goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. It's not too late. We have the opportunity to do these things, which should be a real cause of hope for us if we have the political and public will to do it.
I just had a question about another species of bird. The sandhill cranes. There's a nesting pair in Los Bluffs, at least for 2 years. I was just curious, is that more of better environment for them, or is that global warming related with that reserve being more dry than previous years? Or I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
That I think isn't necessarily climate change. I think it's more restoration, truly. Sandhill cranes used to be found in Missouri on a large scale. But even though we do have well-established, wetlands in Missouri, it's really pretty spectacular compared to other states. We have, just a small portion of what used to be, here in Missouri, and those big rivers that have been dammed and, channeled and things like that, those changes have really affected the distribution of sandhill cranes, for example. And so when we're seeing them return to these conservation areas, it's really, I think, a big nod to the habitat management that these people have been doing for decades. So, yeah.
I want to, one second there, I want to go to an online question. Heather is watching virtually. Thank you for tuning in, Heather. She's interested in turning her yard into a native landscape. And she asked, is there a landscaping company you recommend? And maybe I can add on to that. What kind of help and services, Chris, Deep Roots provide people that want to plant native but don't really know where to, how to get started? And
Our in-house tongue-in-cheek remark is that we do everything but dig the hole. So resources for local native plant providers, nursery producers, and the growing community of contractors who I was very fortunate to be a part of early in my career that specialize in eco-supportive landscape practices. And at deeproots.org, we have archived all of our educational webinars. We do a twice monthly series that brings in different experts and topics. And for the do-it-yourselfer, which is actually the bulk of our audience is a get out there and do it yourself. But for those of us who need a little support or need a little strong back to get the work done, there is a community of contractors and practitioners who specialize in this, who are part of our educational community, learning and growing and teaching all at the same time. This is a dynamic dialogue. So our stories and those of the practitioners who support us are ever changing. It's a daily eye-opening conversation.
deeproots.org, Heather. The great starting point. Okay.
Dr. Dorfman, yeah, you mentioned Guam. My wife and I just got back from Puerto Rico, 10 days down there, and we spent 3 days on the neighboring island of Vasquez. And there we saw the impact of the military on over half of that island. And while they took it over during World War II, the real damage became after the war. Has there been a studies about the military's impact on nature in general?
Not that I know of, but it would surprise me if it hasn't happened. I'm not familiar with a specific study, but I can talk about certain things like on the island of Midway, the military built seawalls to protect its airfield, and the albatross that are trying to get, the parents fly over the seawall, nest, and then the babies try to get to the ocean and are blocked by the seawall, and that can really devastate them. Not as much as the marine plastic, but it is certainly a big issue for them. So I know there are plenty of examples where this has happened, but I'm not sure of a sort of comprehensive study.
Very actively trying to fix the things that done around the world.
Now that's an interesting question too. And the question was, is the military trying to fix the things it's done around the world? You know, and I'm probably not the right person to ask that of, but I mean, just because I don't have the background knowledge, but there are places that I'm aware, for instance, in San Diego, where they have a large military base, firing range. They do a lot of habitat mitigation to make up for the habitat that they're destroying through the shells that they're practicing with. So there is a sense of environmental responsibility. Whether it's a formalized program, I'm not sure, but it's certainly it's not a complete blank slate for them. Sure.
There is in place through the Land Trust Alliance nationwide conservation efforts. The Department of Defense is one of the largest landowners in our country, and their natural spaces that are owned for the purposes of military exercises are being protected through conservation easements and through restoration efforts. In fact, one of my mentors, Steve Applebaum, cut his teeth in the industry in the 70s, restoring the Flint Hills grasslands where the Big Red One did their artillery trainings out in the areas around Fort Riley. So great responsibility, great land holdings, very deep pockets, and that work is being done. If you look into Sentinel Landscapes, that's the program that DoD is partnering with Land Trust Alliance on to preserve and set aside those areas for both military prowess and open pine forest, woodland habitat for woodpeckers, et cetera.
Thank you.
Right, we're past the bottom of the hour, we're running a little overtime here. So let's make this the last question. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about treating insects in the neighborhood, the lawn companies that come around. They've probably been to my house at least 8 times to sell me on having blanketing, and they, as I say, I think the insects, we need to feed the birds and we want the birds, and they have all kinds of excuses they make up, not true. But all around me, probably 4 houses down each direction and the same across the street. I live in Fairway, sort of an organized neighborhood from the 60s. And it is just a huge problem. Our bird population is very small now. Now you can still see, I can go out in the spring and see 5 different kinds of woodpeckers, but the everyday birds that are not robins and cardinals, have pretty much vacated because there's nothing for them. And it's a real hard sell. They're young people. They whip in on their little scooters and really think they're sold. They're proselytizing to me. They've taken the place of the Bible group that visited not so often. And we have these spray people. Any ideas on how to educate a huge community? It's not just my street, it's everywhere.
Yeah. I'll leave, you can have that one.
Better living through chemistry, right?
Right, yeah.
That is again a symptom of a practice that may be well-intentioned, right? We want to engage with our outdoor spaces. We want to protect our children. We want to protect our pets from pestilence. But the problem with that approach is very American, and it's that it's not just the mosquitoes. We incorporate systemic pesticides into our nursery stock at our big box nursery stores, and that does not stop at the damaging aphid or the beetle that causes plant decline. Those chemicals know no boundaries. They do not abide by your property line. Mosquito Joe serves your neighbor, and Mosquito Joe keeps giving into your property as well. So we get the unintended effects of that practice, and we need to kind of shake off our comfort zone a little bit and recognize that the bugs were here before we were, right?
Hopefully we'll be here after us.
God willing, yes.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that one of the goals that we have for this Arboretum as we start to expand its use is to be a sort of demonstration garden for sustainable gardening and the kind of biodiversity that you can have on this, because we are, aside from we don't have really any neighbors on this 14 acres. UMKC fortunately is very proactive in conservation too. So we have great neighbors. We've got a big property, and we're really going to be able to use this. So 2 years from now, bring your neighbors over here and we'll be happy to talk to them. And of course, one of the great things about having Deep Roots up here with us is the idea of partnership, so that we can get that message even further. So,
Kristen, how much is educating the public part of your job?
It's a huge part.
Yeah.
It's probably a third of what I do is, talks, presentations, and answering public questions. And I was just thinking about your question, how do I get this word out? How do I make them understand? I think many people just have no clue. No clue. You know, they don't even know what they don't know. And so just person to person, you know, communication is so important to me. Many people call me, they just, you know, they want to know more, which is great. That first step, that reaching out. But just conversations are so important. Face-to-face communication, I found really valuable, big part of my job.
Well, thank you for coming here today
Yeah,
to be part of our program. Thank you, Chris, as well. Dr. Dorfman, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for taking time out of your Saturday morning to be here at the library to attend this program. You have 2 hours and 20 minutes to see more of Change to the Sky. So thank you and have a great rest of your weekend.